Welcome to Face the Nation. I'm Leslie Stahl. It's Mother's Day, a good time, we thought, to reflect on the demise of the old Dick and Jane stereotype of the American family. In fact, it barely exists at all. Working father, housewife mother with 2 kids make up just 5% of all families. Today, most mothers with young children, nearly 60%, go to work.
Okay, here we go.
Still, the United States is the only industrialized nation in the world, with the exception of South Africa, without a national child care policy. In order to work, mothers are turning to daycare. But because there's a shortage of facilities and no standardized regulations, it has been for many an agonizing proposition.
You don't know how many work hours are lost because people are sitting at a desk and look busy, but their mind is 25 miles away with a child that they left in a situation that they're really uncomfortable with.
Some progress in dealing with the problem has been made by big business. About 2,000 companies now offer some form of daycare. But in the meantime, the Reagan administration has been cutting funds for child care, including nutrition programs.
We in 1986 are going to stop the anti-abortion referendums once and for all.
Younger women are beginning to express a resentment toward the women's liberation movement for having focused on abortion and ERA and for neglecting this whole area of family life.
I'll see you later. Bye.
Should the government get into the business of child care for working parents? We'll ask the Secretary of Labor, William Brock. Has the women's movement gone astray? We'll ask columnist Ellen Goodman, economist Sylvia Ann Hewlett, and president of Wheaton College, Alice Emerson. Working mothers doing double duty, an issue facing the nation.
From CBS News, Washington, Face the Nation with White House correspondent Leslie Stahl.
We talked earlier with Labor Secretary William Brock about the fact that 50 million women are currently in the American workforce and about the calls for a national child care policy.
It's been good for the country to have women work. We're all better off. But we have not faced the fact that it's caused enormous strains on the American family, and not enough businesses are facing up to questions like daycare or flex time or parental leave, the things that would allow husband and wife to work and still maintain the family integrity and the strength of the family.
Well, let me get specific with you. There are 2 bills now wending their way through Congress. One would provide more money for daycare facilities and preschool programs. Another would mandate parental leave, meaning that mothers or fathers could take off up to 18 weeks when a baby is first born and be assured that when they come back, they'll still have their job. Do you support those laws? Should they be laws? Does the administration support them?
We haven't really made a final decision on those bills, but I think it is fair to ask whether or not mandation is the right approach. I think most of us in this administration feel that voluntary approaches are generally better, and we question, I think, certain aspects of those bills. For example, the fact that they would affect small business down to 5 employees. That's really tough on a very small business to do the same thing that GM would do automatically, for example. So we're going to ask some questions. We're going to look at it and say maybe encouragement is a better approach than mandatory effort.
Well, what about women who are pregnant? Why shouldn't there be a national policy that says a woman can take off time to care for her infant? 18 weeks isn't all that much time. Why shouldn't that be national policy?
Well, I think, for myself at least, I would encourage any effort to provide for parental leave like that.
Yeah, but why just encourage? What if a woman has this job and it's only an encouragement so her boss can say, well, tough. It's not a law. You've taken your time off. Your job isn't here anymore when you come back. Is it fair to penalize the woman?
I wonder if it's really fair to think that that is going to be the case in the future. We're going to be short of people. We're going to be short of skills. One of the things that brought women to the workforce is that we need that talent. And managers that start playing that kind of games are not going to be very successful in business. So I'm not sure that we need to have an absolutely categorical federal law of that sort.
Let me ask you a serious question. Do you think if men had children that we'd have these protections?
I'm going to tell you, if men had children, we had a whole lot of different world in a lot of different ways. Probably a better world, too. But
I don't know about
no, I don't know about that. At least I do think that this country would have moved with a bit more sensitivity to solve some of the problems we've had, not just with women entering the workforce, but with women's opportunity to participate in any aspect of the society. They ought to have a full right.
I bet if men had children, that there would be this protection. So therefore,
I tell you, my attitude is that men do have children, and those of us who have them love them and care about them a lot, and we're willing to listen and try to accommodate to this new circumstance.
all right, let me ask you about the other bill, which is increasing money for daycare facilities. The Reagan administration has cut monies for services for preschool children, cut nutrition funds. You seem to be moving in the opposite direction from some of these bills. Do you think it's time to turn that around and start putting more money into facilities mainly for low-income families, for all of these women, poor women, who have to go to work and have children back at home?
Leslie, we are so desperately overspending in Washington that when you say, should we spend more, you got to say, well, we're going to spend less on, and you got to choose what your priorities are. That's hard to do with Graham Redmond, with the budget crisis we have in the United States. But it at least is fair to ask, are we doing as a country, whether it's federal, state, or local, or business or union, are we doing enough in the daycare area? And the answer is no, we're not.
But if the answer isn't money, what's the answer?
Answer it may be money. The question is who provides it, where do you get it? It may be also looking at standards. We may have, at the state level, for example, made it more difficult to have daycare centers by trying to put in very rigid and very tough standards that make it so expensive that people can't afford daycare. I mean, that's one of the problems. You've got to look at the whole range of issues surrounding the debate. But the fact is that a man or a woman who is worried about their child is a less productive employee on the plant floor. So you've got to find some way to respond to that problem.
Let me point out that in San Francisco, there's a new law that mandates that when a new building is constructed, that they provide space for a daycare facility. It strikes me as interesting that that is a law that was passed in a city with a woman mayor and women controlling the city council. Do we have to have women finally in positions of power before we are going to have any movement on this?
The fact that women are being elected really does make a difference. It does help. But it isn't necessary for a woman necessarily to be mayor for the mayor to be sensitive to the problems. It does mean that women have to be involved. They have to point out the problems that are unique in their situation.
Good point. There are no women in the Reagan White House.
There's one, Nancy.
Do you think
And
she's
she's a
pointing out
knockout.
these? Do you think she's pointing out these problems?
Well, I'm not privy to all of those conversations, but we've got some pretty strong women in this administration.
Let me ask you about affirmative action. Attorney General Edwin Meese says that the affirmative action laws for hiring of women are being enforced around the country as a quota, and that therefore they should be changed. People say he wants to weaken them. It's known that you want to keep these laws as they are. Where is this issue? We've been told time and again the President's about to make a decision. No decision's been made. Where does it stand?
We've had a lot of discussions on how best to have an affirmative action program, how to have one that works without quotas. I don't think anybody in this country believes in quotas. And to the extent that I am there, I'm going to try to administer the law so that there are no quotas, implicit or explicit. The discussion has been ongoing for some time. Ultimately, the President may want to decide it, but I don't know when.
Think they'll just leave it the way it is?
I don't know.
Let this whole debate just sort of wither away? Is that what you'd like?
Well, we're going to have to change some of our regulations under any circumstances, because there have been a couple of cases identified where Labor Department people did go beyond what the law allows. Whether we will change the executive order, only the President can answer that, and I don't know what he will decide.
Labor Secretary William Brock. We'll be back.
More like the cowboy and his pussy, riding fast and having fun.
Joining us now from New York, Sylvia Ann Hewlett, author of the book A Lesser Life, The Myth of Women's Liberation in America, and mother of 3. From Boston, syndicated columnist Ellen Goodman, mother of 1, and Alice Emerson, president of Wheaton College, the women's college in Norton, Massachusetts, mother of 2. Welcome, everybody. Why don't we start our discussion with Dr. Hewlett in New York, who has written a book about, I gather, the failure of the women's liberation movement. You say in your book that women are no better off today than they were when the movement started. Is that really true? Do you really think that's true?
Well, what I say in my book, Leslie, is that women are caught between a rock and a hard place in 1986. Many of us have lost the traditional securities of marriage. You know, divorce is up there at 50% of all couples. And on the other hand, we have failed to gain significant earning power in the labor market. The wage gap, the gap between what men and women earn, is still the same as it was 50 years ago. And a real shocker, a quarter of all working women, when working full-time, earn less than $10,000 a year. So there is a great deal of economic insecurity for women in the modern economy.
But let me ask you again, you blame the women's liberation movement for what? What was their failure?
Well, I think in the 70s, many of those battles we all fought for were very important. Equal access to jobs and education, for instance, was a very critical thing to try and achieve, because women are increasingly having to stand on their own feet in the modern world. But there was a whole agenda around motherhood and family that we missed out on. You know, we were out there trying to clone the male competitive model. We entered the world of work on male terms. And I think that we forgot that 90% of women will have children at some point in their lives. And right now, we are a society where 60% of working women have no rights to job-protected leave at the time of birth, for instance, and certainly have very little access to things like quality childcare.
Okay,
this is not an agenda which the movement stressed.
Let's go to Ms. Goodman in Boston and ask if you agree that the women's movement neglected these important issues and because of it, perhaps, is becoming irrelevant today.
I don't think they neglected these issues at all. My impression, having covered a lot of this stuff for the last 15 years, is that they were enemies to child care. They were enemies to parental leave policies, but the women's rights organizations certainly did not make the enemies list. They were the names behind all of the names on the bills, the pressure behind some of these changes in policy, and they have certainly been the people who've kept the working woman as high on their agenda.
But you must admit, Ms. Goodman, that they didn't talk about family issues too much. Talking about equal access to jobs, anti-abortion, ERA, but very little about raising children and being mothers.
Well, I think there are different public policy agendas, but I don't think, we've said for an awful lot of time that the women's movement didn't talk about family issues, and while they weren't the same kind of policy issues that you vote up and down on all the time, I just don't see it that way. Most of the women in these women's rights organizations, after all, also have families and suffer the pressures. I agree that change has been lopsided.
Well,
you could make a case that one generation has substituted, you know, depression for stress. But I don't think that you can look to the women's rights organizations as the culprit.
Well, let's turn to Dr. Emerson, who's the president of a women's college. We do hear a lot about a backlash against the feminist movement. Do you feel it on your campus? Are young women feeling that perhaps this movement is irrelevant to their lives today?
I think the thing the contemporary woman student feels the most as the result of the women's movement is the need to be a member of the paid workforce as a major part of her life, and also the great opportunities and access to new jobs which the women's movement was largely responsible for opening. On the other hand, I think that those who are still in college are quite naive about the fact that they think the battles are all won and over. And if they talk to their older sisters who are a few years out and who are a bit more experienced, I think they find that one of the disappointments is that these new job opportunities are not just welcoming women and promoting them along in the same ways that they promoted men. But on the other hand, the mothers, and this is Mother's Day, of this generation of women think that their daughters have much more opportunity, and in many ways they're envious. So I think what we're seeing is a pattern of evolution of change, and the women's movement had a very important part in opening up one aspect of that.
Dr. Hewlett?
Leslie, you know, as part of my book, A Lesser Life, I went back and I talked to all of my ex-students at Barnard College. I was the professor there for 7 years. And really the great poignancy of this research effort was hearing the enormous yearning for family that came out of these young women. When I interviewed them in the fall of 1984, they ranged in age from 23 to 35. They were all clambering up various ladders of career success, mostly in business because I did teach economics. Some were married, some were divorced, none had children. And although we started off talking about how they were doing on the job, what they wanted to talk about was their tremendous anxieties that they would remain childless, they would fail to find a mate. And if you look at the surveys, you find that their anxiety is well-founded. If you take women doctors, age 40, women scientists, women business managers, you will find that only 1/3 of them have had children. So, you know, clearly something's gone wrong. We've created a situation where even the brightest and best women in our society still feel in some ways they have to choose between family or career. And I guess I feel that's unfair.
Let's go over to Boston, and Ms. Goodman, there is something to that, isn't there?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that we have to concentrate not on what we did wrong, but on what needs to be done next. I mean, change, as I said, has been lopsided. Women have taken on more of the old male responsibilities than men have taken on of the old female responsibilities, and society hasn't begun to adjust to this real change, to this real movement of women from one life pattern to many. And there's a lot of work that's left to be done, and I would hope that we would concentrate on that.
Why is it that men aren't taking over more of what we're talking about? Mrs. Emerson, why is it still that child care is a woman's issue?
Well, one of the things that it seems to me is apparent is that the raising of children has always been women's responsibility, and it probably will be in terms of the primary care for a long time. And one of the problems that we have now is that because women need to work, we need to have those incomes for families, we now have 3 people in effect doing 2 people's jobs, although really it's the woman doing 2 jobs and the man doing 1. And this is bound to cause a lot of stress. But another part of the problem is I don't think we're straightforward enough in talking about what the realities are. I couldn't agree more with Dr. Hewlett that young women yearn to have families and that they're concerned about how they're going to make it all fit, although most of them I think still think they will. But what we haven't done is to really talk about what the real American family is. And instead of pretending that the American family is that traditional family that you spoke of at the beginning of only 5%, we have to begin to look at what is the real family structure and then try to plan our social policies around it.
Let me go to Boston for 1 minute and ask Ms. Goodman why she thinks that if, as you said before, this whole question of child care has been discussed for years, we haven't gotten anywhere with it. Men have children. It's shown that when companies provide this service, their workers are more productive. Why has it taken so long?
Well, maybe I would have something of a psychological economic argument if you want to describe it that way. I think what has happened over the past 100 years of our economy is that each member of the family has left home to work. First, fathers left home to work from the farms to the factories, and then mothers began to leave home. And there is, I think, somewhere in all of us a sense that we don't want to consider ourselves solely economic people, that we do want some centers, some sense of home, some sense of tradition. So I think there's part of the reason is psychological, and part of the reason is a political opposition to that.
Yes,
Dr. Hewlett.
You know, I think perhaps one of the solutions is to concentrate on pinpointing the economic consequences of neglecting our children. You know, having a child is surely a private choice and a private joy. But it's not just an expensive hobby. It's not the same as taking a winter vacation or buying a second car. Those children are the workers of the future and the citizens of the future, and the competitive edge of America in the 1990s. Right now, We have a country where 25% of kids are growing up in poverty, where there's more child abuse, more preemie babies than ever before. And I found when I tackled these issues with a group of businessmen at the Economic Policy Council, they were able to focus in on the economic dimensions of doing a better job by giving our kids a good start in life. And in a way, it's not a women's rights issue only. It clearly is an issue of all of us.
I think
when we look at the future.
The men aren't really listening, I don't think.
Well,
Mrs.
no, I think Dr. Hewlett strikes on something, though, which is a part of the American national character, which is we do have, and I think particularly in this conservative era, an intense sense of individualism, that every tub on its own bottom, every family makes its own decision, and we have to bolster up the community aspect of that, that we do have some sense of continuity and obligation to and sense of community with each other.
Dr. Emerson?
I agree that we have lost in some sense our sense of collective responsibility, but it seems to me that what we have to recognize, and Secretary Brock alluded to it, is that when it's economically good for the country for women to be in the workforce, we open the doors and make that happen. But at the same time, we don't seem to think that it's economically worth it to put the resources into daycare and to support the nurture of this next generation, which is so desperately needing it. I mean, 20% of all babies are born out of wedlock. Now, this is a different family pattern, and a family pattern which really desperately needs help.
What is it in society that can talk as if it understands, but then not do anything to change the situation?
Well, it's not to men's advantage to give power to women.
Is it simply that?
That's
Dr.
part of
Hewlett?
it.
Dr. Hewlett?
But I guess I feel that our families are at risk today. We have a great deal of family piety in government. We seem to care a lot about mothers and our family structures, but we don't put our money where our mouth is. And I think that one good piece of good news that came out of the work I did was that I persuaded people like Gerald Ford and 75 employers, some labor leaders, as well as some community groups, that there were 5 policies that were possible even in an age of budget cutting, which constitute economic sense in the 1980s.
All right. Thank you all very much for giving us your views about working mothers on this Mother's Day. Thank you. We will be back with our cartoon in a moment. Our special cartoon today is by Steve Kelly of the San Diego Union. I'm Leslie Stahl, mother of 1, wishing my mom and everybody's mom a happy Mother's Day. Join us next week.
Face the Nation with White House correspondent Leslie Stahl was produced by CBS News, which is solely responsible for the selection of today's guests and topic. This broadcast originated in Washington, D.C.